Welcome to the HC Insider Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the commodities sector and the people within it. I'm your host, Paul Chapman. Today we're talking Europe's energy transition and the policy frameworks behind it. Europe has set some of the most ambitious goals around net zero and electrification of transportation and industry. Yet it faces strong geopolitical competition, both for the investments, technology and know-how, with acts such as the US IRA, but also accessing the critical metals it needs to transform its industry. Today we're talking about the policy support behind that challenge, some of the complexity, and even the role of the commodity traders within it. Our guest is Julia Poliscanova. Julia is Senior Director of Vehicles and Supply Chain at Transport and Environment, a European NGO and think tank. Julia's career has been in European policy and politics, including being an advisor to the EU Parliament, and has an energy master's in battery and fuel cells. As always, you can really support the show by please leaving a positive review on the platform you're listening on. It really does help expand our audience and thus enable us to continue to get great guests for the show. I hope you enjoy the episode. Julia, welcome to the show.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about Europe and Europe's energy transition and the policies and thoughts around that. So I'm delighted to have this discussion in light of the Critical Raw Materials Act and all of the various legislation that's in the works. Can we start at the broad level? When we talk about the energy transition in Europe, can you help orientate us as to what that means and what's gone on to date?
Yes, absolutely. Europe is probably the continent with the most ambitious climate framework today in the world. So we already have a net zero goal by 2050. So it's a binding target all across the economy in Europe to really reduce emissions to zero or net zero in some cases. And more recently, Europe has also put in place a framework on a direction towards that 2050 goal, a framework to 2030. And within that framework, we now have a binding target to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions across the economy by 55% by 2030. And some of the key sectors there are, of course, renewables, where we now have a goal of 45% of all energy to come from renewable sources by 2030. That's energy, not just power. It's a lot higher in the power sector. And also we have a very recent goal agreed specifically for road transport, where all new cars and new vans, so that's small trucks, for example, in the US, will have to be zero emission, largely electric from 2035. And we're currently discussing something similar for larger, heavier trucks. So this is a huge transformation that is underway. The framework is there, so the what is clear. Zero emission technologies, be it renewables, solar, wind, or electric vehicles and battery storage. And the debate now is really quick moving to how to this in view of the global competition, how to do this with jobs and transition in mind, etc., etc. That's why we're, of course, talking to you today.
Okay, so a couple of questions before we get there. One, relatively mundane, but to get us all on the same page. What does it mean to have a binding agreement? Who is bound by it? What is that just in terms of enforcement, in terms of all countries acting cohesively together? Is the UK following suit? I know they're no longer in Europe, but can you just help us understand the mechanics of it being a binding agreement? How serious and what's the penalty for transgression?
Yes. So there's two things. The overarching laws with those CO2 targets, they are binding on the EU. So they're binding on the European institutions, including its member states. And that means that if Europe misses its targets, it can be taken to court, for example. And its member states can be taken to court if they do not comply or not in line with that. Now, I'm just talking about the EU. So the UK is not bound by those agreements, but the UK has its own really ambitious carbon budgets and net zero goals. Similarly. So binding on the institutions, they can be taken to court. Now, the other laws that I mentioned, notably around electric vehicles, for example, that is actually a regulation that is binding on the industry. So that regulation is specifically on car makers and van makers. And that means that if a car maker misses the targets, it's not just the 2035 target, there are progressive reduction targets for 2025, for 2030, before going to zero, so all electric by 2035. So if the car maker misses those goals, they are actually automatically, via the European Court of Justice, obliged to pay fines. And the fines are quite steep. So there is quite a strong enforcement mechanism for those industry regulations in Europe.
Yeah, incredibly ambitious. And we're going to talk, as you say, about the how, because that's no mean lift, right, to achieve that for both manufacturers, but also for the continent as a whole. So my other question, why is Europe leading the charge here with such ambitious goals compared to, say, the US, compared to China? What is the thought process behind that? Because there are also costs in terms of competition, etc., etc. But what is the why here? Beyond perhaps just obviously the immediate and acute threat of climate change.
That's the thing. It's a really good question. I would say, if not Europe to lead this, who else, right? We are actually doomed. If there is one continent where, due to politics, the politicians in place and the economics and the GDP, this is possible and that should go first, it's Europe, right? We are one of the most developed continents, and the politics in Europe is such that people actually support this action. So all of this that I described for 2030 is under the agenda of the European Green Deal. And that was actually something that the European Commission president, when she was sworn to become the president back now in 2019, was publicly announcing, and it was publicly supported. So a lot of people actually voted into institutions, be it European Commission or European Parliament in 2019, were voted on the mandate of this climate action. So many people want it in Europe. Politicians have been historically more open and progressive on climate action in Europe. And our economy and GDP means that we can actually afford to do that. And today, given that Europe has announced all this, because you're right, I mean, going full electric in the road sector is a huge transformation. And now Europe has announced it. It almost has now an obligation to show to the rest of the world that it can do it. Because if it fails here, other politicians in other bigger economies with more emissions per capita probably will not venture into this in the future, which is what we need, of course, for the global action on climate.
To say as well, Europe is one of the most industrialized economies or regions in the world, but also suffers relatively from a lack of raw materials, particularly hydrocarbons, that are fueling most of the other world's economies. There is also a strategic goal here as well to not move from one dependency to another.
Absolutely. I think that's a really excellent point. And I didn't mention that, of course, especially following the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this sentiment is really acute here in Brussels, where I am based. For example, actually following that invasion, Europe has upped its target on renewables. Previously, we talked about 40%, and now we talk about 45%, for example, by 2030. So we sometimes call electrification also the freedom electrons, so to speak, because indeed, that's something that we produce domestically, and that's something that can make us resilient as well.
Where does nuclear sit? Is that considered? Where does that sit which side of the equation does that sit on?
There is no easy answer to that, I'm afraid, Paul. It's a really difficult conversation in Brussels, and I think the answer will be dependent on who you ask. Generally speaking, within European energy policy, there is an agreement that the mix of energy technologies, provided they're meeting the CO2 thresholds, is actually up to member states. So countries can decide whether or not they support or not nuclear. Of course, France is very much in favor, whereas many other countries, be it Austria or Germany, are a lot more reluctant to invest in nuclear. So that really depends. But there is, at European level, a really big conflict there that actually quite often delays a lot of the progress. For example, recently that we were really slow in agreeing the clean fuels mandate for aviation fuels, because we couldn't really agree and figure out whether or not those fuels produced with nuclear can be considered to be zero emission. And then they're not. However, on the other hand, we now have this Net Zero Industry Act, or the Green Tech Act, which is part of this framework to respond to the US IRA. And there's a bit of a mixed approach where nuclear is in as a strategic technology, but it won't get subsidies. So this is sometimes this mixed approach, because we don't actually have one clear line on that as Europe.
Yeah, okay, great. And you've mentioned it now. So let's move on to the Net Zero Industrial Act and the CRM, the Critical Raw Materials Act. Staying with that Net Zero Industrial Act, that's somewhat seen as a direct response to the US IRA. What is the concern there? That the IRA is so competitive that Europe then faces their indigenous industry, autochthonous industry in renewables starting to decamp over there and investment being drawn to the US?
As I said before, so we have these clear climate targets, right? And for a very long time, Europe had this very laissez-faire attitude to industrial policy. And first, China was cementing its lead in key technologies such as batteries and electric vehicles for decades. Today, China is the leading exporter, actually, of electric vehicles as well as batteries in the world. But I think the wake-up call for Europe really was the US Inflation Reduction Act, because they were just, I think, people in Europe, including myself, were amazed just how quickly the US started to catch up. We had loads of plans on battery factories in Europe. We did some analysis last year where we showed that actually, if all these plans come to fruition, Europe can be self-sufficient in batteries for electric cars, for storage by 2027. And then suddenly with US IRA, we saw how quickly a lot of these plans and investments started to be shifted to the US, because of course the factories are not yet there, right? And that the capital, the resources, the skills are limited. So indeed, the US IRA was a wake-up call. So Europe now in February announced a package of measures that included regulations such as the Net Zero Industrial Act, but also other things like the global dimension, for example, skills, etc. If we look at the Net Zero Industry Act, there's many good things it does, and I'll highlight them in a second. But one thing that is really lacking is funding, is that investment. And of course, that's what US IRA is about. It's so bankable, it's so simple, it's so long term. If I knew how, I would build a battery factory in the US because of the subsidies that I would be given. So that's really still very much a gap in Europe, despite all these acts that the finance is not clearly there. But Net Zero Industry Act is interesting in that it's for the first time selects key technologies to focus, key green technologies. So the focus there is on batteries, on solar and wind, for example, so renewables, on heat pumps, on grid technologies, as well as electrolyzers for green hydrogen. And selecting them also means that we can now focus, we can simplify permitting for projects in the sectors, we can focus in the future, hopefully funding on them, right? So it's this quite important piece of law that selects the focus, the priorities, and then puts in place some of the key provisions on permitting, for example, to help accelerate that in Europe.
That's very clear. Thank you for that. And then the CR, let's move on to the Critical Raw Materials Act. What is that? Where does it sit right now in the legislature, and what's its goal?
Yes, so Critical Raw Materials Act has been in the works for a while, but I think now with US IRA it just simply became a lot more urgent for Europe. When it comes to critical raw materials, we have three challenges in Europe to address. So we need to secure sufficient supply of these critical metals, like everyone else, for all the technologies. We need to do this sustainably and responsibly, and that's really important from a European perspective. That's what's important, right? There's almost no Christmas dinner conversation with a glass of wine without someone mentioning cobalt in Congo, for example. And the third challenge is to also do this in a way which is diverse, right? So we actually do not rely on any one country for this supply, even if it's sufficient and even if it's sustainable. So the Critical Raw Materials Act tries to address all of these three challenges to a certain degree. I'll highlight four things that are proposed, which I think are really important for the listeners, and that is key part of the debate. Having said that, before I go there, just to stress that these are still European Commission proposals. They are now with the European Parliament and with European governments to amend, so they can change substantially before they will be agreed as the final regulation, which should happen by the end of this year. So it's quite a fast procedure for Europe. So what does CRM Act do exactly? So first of all, it actually selects and has a list of strategic raw materials. It's similar to critical raw materials. So you, of course, have things like lithium, nickel, manganese on it, but it also has some of the other things on the list which maybe are not so critical in the academic definition, but are strategic for the future. Copper, for example, is a notable example here to add. Now, as I said, it's not yet a final legislation, so there's a lot of push from different different parts of the industry and academia on what should be included. So a big push is to include aluminium on the list as well. It's not currently out, as well as things such as phosphorus. So it's still for LFP batteries, for example. So it still remains to be seen whether or not we will have those. But there is a list of on what to focus. The second big pillar of this law is actually to put there aspirational EU-wide targets on self-sufficiency. This include a target of 10% of all those strategic metals extraction to actually come from Europe by 2030. It also includes a target of 40% of all the refining and processing of these very same strategic metals to be done in Europe also by 2030. And there's also a goal on recycling. So Europe wants at least 15% of its demand of critical raw materials to come from recycling. And an additional goal has been added around diversification, and that's that third challenge I mentioned around concentration in one single country. So the target states that not more than 65% of the supply of any of the strategic metals in any part of the value chain should come from one country, one third country outside of Europe by 2030. So these are the goals. The goals are not binding, and that leads me to the third pillar, important pillar of this proposal, and that is the framework of strategic projects. So the idea is we have all these goals. They're not binding because it's hard to make them binding on somebody, but we will then be selecting projects throughout the value chain from extraction to processing to recycling to meet those goals that we identified for Europe. And that's actually probably the most tangible part of this proposal. So if there is a framework, a process to become a strategic project, and if you are a strategic project, either in Europe or also outside of Europe, for example, there can be a nickel mine in New Caledonia that can qualify, for example. So if you become that strategic project, you have lots of benefits. You have faster permitting, for example, you can have access to funding, you can get help with offtake agreements, etc. So really quite an important label there. And last thing to add, maybe more on the sustainability side, Critical Raw Materials Act as such does not propose any new environmental requirements. We have environmental requirements around water, waste, habitats, so biodiversity in Europe already. We have an international framework on sustainable due diligence that is now being discussed. But what Critical Raw Materials Act does, it cements them and has this really important balance. I think it's a really great trick that it does. It says, yes to strategic projects. Yes, at the same time, you have to meet really key environmental criteria, but the process can go faster. So you have to meet environmental standards on water, on waste, on biodiversity. You have to have communities on board. But at the same time, you can be a lot faster in showing compliance with those standards. And if after you've met all these requirements, people are still against and you are in the courts, the project will win and will go ahead. So the projects are given this overriding public interest status, which has proven to work in renewables, for example, and that's now being worked on. So this balance between the speed and strategic projects on the one hand, and keeping the environmental safeguards on the other, in our view, is a really important part of this proposal.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to come on to the geopolitical competition for these resources and what Europe's going to have to offer places like Africa and so forth, when you have China on the one hand and the US on the other, and there's some interesting headlines that come out of that already. Well, I want to zoom in for a minute on the 40% refining and processing in Europe by 2030. Because that, to me, and we've done a number of episodes with Chris Berry and Simon Moores and Henry Sanderson talking about how, for the most part, 80% of the battery processing, refining, all of the components that go into it sits in China, and they've effectively had a 10-year head start on many of these, and a lot of the actual know-how and skills sit there. How is that a realistic goal? And how does the Act address, outside of these sort of incentives or at least fast tracking of various aspects, does Europe have the talent, the skills to actually achieve that 40% target? I know you've got companies like Northvolt and so forth really pioneering. A lot of that know-how sits in China. Is that being addressed at all?
I think the short answer to your question is that if you look at this today, we don't have skills, capacity, expertise to do that. But I think that's why it's so important to set that goal, first of all, to make the direction clear, something aspirational. And then, yes, we need measures and support to get there. Some things are addressed in Critical Raw Materials Act, some things are not. For example, there is a whole chapter on skills and actually developing those skills, having various skills academies in critical metals is really important. It's an important pillar, and a lot of different bodies at European level are trying to do that. The second one to mention is actually when we look at this, but we only look at battery metals. So we only looked at lithium, nickel, and cobalt so far. We actually see that this 40% goal is reachable. Europe already does quite a bit of processing in nickel and cobalt in the north, right? In Scandinavia, in Finland, for example, with nickel. And for lithium, we have a lot of projects in the pipeline. Of course, they're all still projects. They need support. And I think that's where really this industrial policy is needed to make this happen. But the potential is there to be self-sufficient in lithium potentially. And this is mostly because of some of the technological advancements there. For example, direct lithium extraction, right, from geothermal brines, which opens up many more resources to get lithium from. So the potential is there to process. On skills and expertise, we used to mine in Europe. We still mine. We have this great mining school, right, in the UK. So I think we can build the skills. But one thing that is not addressed in the Critical Raw Materials Act or this framework at all is the investment part of this, the financing. It's not just the fact that America has all the skills. They also struggle with that, right? But what they're doing via US IRA, via these production credits, is that they're making it so attractive to build those capacities in the US. At the same time, in Europe, we have really high energy prices, and that is also making us uncompetitive because these processes are very capital intensive. So in my view, what is missing and what needs to be added is some sort of quite targeted critical metals fund to help with not just CapEx, but OpEx of these projects to scale them up. Interestingly, just the other day, something similar was proposed in France. France proposed a critical metals fund, but it's just for French projects. We have a lot of potential outside of France, and I think it's important Europe thinks as Europe. When we talk about processing, one last thing to add there, Paul, this is not just about the extraction side of it. It's also about recycling. The very same material recovery expertise are needed to properly recycle batteries, recover metals, and turn them into new batteries. So developing those skills and supporting them with funding, as I mentioned, is really no regrets for Europe, also from a circularity perspective. So I hope we get our act together there in the future.
Yeah, we had Clean Systems on talking about battery recycling, which was fascinating and obviously quite a nascent industry. We just had Glencore announce they're getting into it. It's complicated and difficult, but also lots of opportunity there.
The HC Insider podcast is brought to you by HC Group, a retained search, intelligence and advisory firm focused solely on the global energy and commodity sector. With 6 locations across Asia, Europe and the Americas and over 50 consultants. To find out more, go to our website, hcgroup.global. There, you can also sign up for our HC Insider content for more interviews and white papers on relevant trends and talent impacts in the commodities world.
One other question here, and I don't want to release my Hayekian bias on some of this stuff, but there is a sense that obviously this is somewhat picking winners. And if you look at, say, Germany, which has had a really robust chemicals industry and automotive industry. And that automotive industry has, for the most part, actually still very much focused on the internal combustion engine and all of the other manufacturers, the ecosystem that surrounds a BMW or Volkswagen in terms of supplying parts. Not only are they somewhat arguably they're behind on the technology side versus a Tesla and what we're seeing in China, but also EVs are incredibly simple vehicles compared to internal combustion engine vehicles in terms of number of parts. And so how, on the flip side, are we addressing concerns from industrial countries like Germany about what could be devastating to their economy in this transition?
That question is at the heart of this transition in Europe. And before we finally agreed this 2035 goal for cars to be zero emission that I mentioned, this was at the top of the debate and been discussed a lot. I think what is happening is a realization that going zero emission going electric is not just something we do in Europe or China. This is now global. Pretty much every country, many countries in the world, not maybe every, now has a strategy to go electric. So it's just a matter of our industry survival. The fact that they need to transition and they need to transform. The days of internal combustion engine have been counted. They have ended. And I think that's something that has taken time for European industry to understand, but many of them actually have understood that. They have seen the writing on the wall. And some of the most vocal proponents and investors in electrification today are actually companies such as Volkswagen or Stellantis or Mercedes, for example. So the transition is happening because it's not about Europe or its policies, it's about global competition of our manufacturers. I would like to argue, and something that I think sometimes, in my views, wrongly said, is that we are going for battery electric because politicians pushed for this. Now, of course, politicians have pushed for cleaner transport. They have pushed for zero emission technologies. But there is not one regulation in the world that is specifically designed to promote Teslas or to promote battery electric vehicles. Hydrogen cars, for example, have had exactly the same chance all along. So the reason why we are going so quickly battery electric as part of our climate and industrial agenda is because purely on economics and technology, it's the best technology. And if we are to keep jobs in our industry, not just today, but in the future, we have to transition, right? We used to have horses and then we went to petrol engines, and horse carriage manufacturers were also complaining last century. This is just the transition. I come from Eastern Europe and I know this debate really wholeheartedly. My dad actually lost a job in some manufacturing plant when Latvia joined the EU because those jobs were just completely uncompetitive and unnecessary. But no one in Latvia questioned the need to go to and be closer to Europe, right? Because it knows something we needed. We just needed to support workers in the transition. And I think it's the same here. We need to go electric. We need to do it faster, but we need to support the transition. And that's why Europe, and Germany in particular, today spends so much money to reskill the workers, retool the factories, and attract manufacturers such as Northvolt to actually produce. And there we had some great news recently where Northvolt actually confirmed that they will be building a factory exactly in Germany.
There is the inevitability about this, not least because obviously part of the sentiment driving this is that EVs are better user experiences for the most part, especially when you solve the charging infrastructure required, which places like Norway certainly have. Let's just, while we've got you, let's talk. So we're talking electric vehicles, but obviously are we talking, where do we stand? Where is the thinking at the moment around battery electric vehicles versus hydrogen fuel cells? And I guess certainly from a technology standpoint, but also a sentiment standpoint, are both these still live? Is hydrogen still a live, viable option being pushed at, or is that slowly moving into the rearview mirror as we look at efficacy and efficiency, and really the emphasis is on BEVs?
So first of all, to say, when it comes to just purely policy frameworks and what's happening in Europe, hydrogen cars today have literally exactly the same incentives, right? So from that perspective, the race is still open. And if something happens in the next 5 or 10 years and something goes wrong on battery metals and hydrogen cars have really some kind of breakthrough in terms of cost and efficiency, we can still go 100% hydrogen cars, right? There's nothing that's stopping that. So from that perspective, but I think it's just purely from economics and technology and efficiency, as you said, that it's now clear today, at least from what we know today, that the future when it comes to light duty transport, so most cars, small trucks, vans, etc., it will be battery electric. The question is still a bit more open on trucks. What I see happening is that the vast majority of truck makers are also going battery electric. But the debate is how big is that niche for hydrogen trucks? Is it 10% or is it 30%? But it's not 50-50. So that's really the road transport. Where I do believe hydrogen, green hydrogen, has a huge role to play, it's in the overall decarbonization of the system. Things like cement or steel, for example. And if we look at transport, in heavy transport, for example, I and we as TNE have done lots of analysis there, see that actually when we look at things like long-haul aviation or shipping, that's where green hydrogen-derived fuels, synthetic kerosene, for example, or ammonia, can really be that close to zero-emission technology that has least impact and is still feasible to propel those heavy vehicles, for example. We don't believe that there is role, though, in those sectors for biofuels. Purely put, for if we really look at sustainable biofuel stocks, they are really limited. You're not going to get far. You're going to maybe get your 1-2% of the needs of those fuels. And when we look at biofuels as such, beyond sustainable ones, they simply produce more harm than they solve via deforestation and indirect land use change and CO2 emissions from that.
Yeah, interesting. We had Michael Bernard on talking about his belief that biofuels are going to be the only other significant contributor to decarbonising transport alongside electrification, and arguing that there would be sufficient, and especially if you stop using them in sort of cars and so forth. But yeah, again, as with all of this, right, there's a lot of it that things are moving so quickly, and a lot of this is still in the trial phase, if you'd like. And I hope is that we fail early so that we can focus on those technologies that really are going to make a difference. But therein lies the challenge as well, right, from an investment standpoint for the broader energy and commodities community that are listening to this. As Tornquist said back at the FT conference, it's both expensive and it's very hard, and you're trying to pick technologies that might win, and the opportunity for disruption is very high. And I want to come back to that actually, but let's move on to the major challenge in some sense is that these critical materials, whichever the bucket ends up being, often sit outside Europe in resource-rich countries, which are often in the global south or developing nations, and you're facing, there's strong competition to acquire them. What is the debate inside Europe about how is it going to incentivize New Caledonia or Tanzania to work with them versus the US, versus Russia and China, and particularly Chinese Belt and Road policy, all of the weight that goes with that?
Yes, that's an excellent question, and that's part of so many debates right now here in Brussels, and I think in many European capitals as well, such as Berlin. It's clear if you look at any map that Europe is never on the top in terms of metals, so it means that for the foreseeable future, as you said, we will be importing those materials. And we are not alone. I agree with many who say that quest for these critical metals will be the geopolitical race of the 21st century. It will replace oil as the thing that everyone wants to get. Now, I think, and that's something that many people are now looking at, that Europe really needs to have some serious thinking about what is its USP, right, coming to all those territories and countries where we are not alone. In my view, there are at least two things that are part of our USP that we should use a lot more and a lot more strategically. One is the fact that all of these countries, resource-rich countries, a lot of them from Zimbabwe to Indonesia to Mexico, want to develop their own supply chain. They don't just want to be the mines of the world. They also want to process metals and even build batteries. And I think that's where Europe can really come, not just with its demands for metals, but more as a partner, an equal partner, and help with technology transfer, knowledge, skills to actually co-develop, co-invest and build not just extraction, but also processing in these countries. So help these countries move up the value chain. And we did talk before about the fact that Europe wants to process 40% of the metals it needs, but it still means that 60% will come from elsewhere. And given that this pie is growing, the opportunity is really huge to help those countries develop, which also helping our diversification agenda. So it's not all done in one country, for example, in China. The second thing that I think we sometimes are a bit shy to mention because we think it's some kind of bureaucratic hurdle, but I think in this global dimension today is also important, is our stance and our high practices around some of the environmental and social safeguards. Are doing things in many cases better in Europe, not always. For example, our waste legislation around extraction tailings is not up for scratch. It can be a lot better, but generally we have high standards and it's in the DNA of many European companies. So building and bringing those high standards always consistently to resource-rich countries is important. At the end of the day, when you are a person working at a mine, for example, in Congo or Chile, you care, and like anyone else in Europe, you want to have a fair wage, you want your water nearby to be clean, right? And you want your community to be developing. And that's something I think Europe can bring. We still have this idea of this European dream that I think we can export elsewhere.
Just to jump in there, very laudable. And obviously something I'm sure all of the listeners share in terms of that is the ideal. But the problem that we face is that most of the countries that house these resources in high abundance are not democracies. The person at the mine is not essentially, doesn't have a franchise to be involved in those decisions. And often high-mindedness, often you're up against other nations or other actors who are purely incentivizing through the economics of the deal to the elite or the owners who actually will benefit, right? So all of those high ideals, those important ideals, I should say, are somewhat dependent on the countries making those decisions having similar institutions, similar organization to Europe, where those externalities and those other factors can be taken into account in the decision process. Just for this to be a success, it does also have to be, those benefits have to be viscerally felt, and the selection being made taking those into account.
That's a very fair point, and maybe I can come in here. So I fully understand that, and I also think we as Europeans should be a bit more strategic, less naive. For example, in the FTA with Chile, right, we actually abandoned some of our WTO language and eventually allowed local producers to be getting that lithium, for example, at lower prices. And I think these compromises are important. But I really want to stress two things. One, every leader that I hear today, be it Chile's president or Zimbabwe's president, are all talking about the fact that they want higher standards and development for their countries, and that they want to have higher value from these resources. And this is exactly what I talk about. That's what we can bring. And another really important point is and I think the only other continent that can do this is also the US. And I think we should work jointly with the US, actually. We should form a stronger buyers club to have a bigger clout in these conversations. But we as Europeans have the second largest consumer market in the world, second largest for electric vehicles, for example. That's why so many Chinese companies want to go here. So if we cut out China and we directly go, for example, to Zimbabwe, and we say, look, we want to co-invest in mine with you, and we have this huge market, so you have a return on your investment for 20 years. And these companies in Europe will be buying this lithium for their vehicles for 20 years. That's a really good long-term deal to that country. And because we do have stable institutions there and a stable market, people will know that we mean business and we mean this. The challenge is that there's very few European companies today that would actually agree to something for 10, 20 years because of a very different shareholder view in European or Western companies compared to the Chinese. Without going too much into detail into that, I think we need to think about that longer term perspective in our dealings with resource-rich countries.
Bringing a knife to a gunfight comes to mind in some of these investments. But okay, the other thing that actually Europe has, and I guess relevant to our listeners, is one of the key competitive advantages that Europe has, albeit, okay, in Switzerland for the most part, and therefore not technically part of Europe. But you obviously have the world's commodity traders, for the most part headquartered within continental Europe. And these are the organizations who actually have the capacity and the capability to access many of these critical metals and have been doing so for a long time. There's been a bit of a sense that it's been quite an opaque world, and also it's been one that has not necessarily been a source of, I don't know, what do you say, pride or whatever for Europe itself. And is there anything in the CRM or anything in Europe, a recognition of these are organizations that we can engage who are actually a competitive advantage for us in terms of getting to these minerals, and actually any legislation around not necessarily how we can regulate them more, which is obviously in the works at the moment given the events last year, but really how can we support these organizations, because they do share our values and they are focused on transparency. They've all made great strides towards that, and I don't want to sound like I'm lobbying for them, but is there any kind of engagement with the commodity traders with the recognition that is a super competitive advantage that Europe has in terms of this act?
Actually, the short answer is that no, I'm not aware of any. But I do agree with you that this is actually an opportunity we have in Europe that we still haven't lost, that we're not exploiting. For example, maybe to give you one interesting fact, when we looked at lithium refining potential in Europe, we actually saw that 1/3 of all the projects announced are in the UK. And we're like, why in the UK? It's actually probably for the similar reason you mentioned, is because there is already their culture and headquarters of some of these mining companies and traders. So it's probably easier for them to secure feedstock of lithium globally and then bring it into the UK and refine it. And if we had a better European cooperation, because we don't have gigafactories, battery gigafactories in the UK so much today, we can then take this refined lithium into Europe and produce cathodes and batteries here. So I think that potential is there. We're not aware of that. So I think it's a good point you raise, and maybe it's something I can take back to my work in Brussels and see, if potential there exists.
Heard it here first on the HC Insider podcast. But that brings me to my final question, which I think is relevant to that, which is, if someone listening today who's involved in various strands of these industries, how do you go about getting a voice in the European Parliament? How do you engage with NGOs such as yourself? For the most part, this is an industry that has shied away from too much engagement as bringing too much of a spotlight. But now the stakes have changed, the table has turned, and there's lots of opportunity. How do you go about that engagement? How do you go about actually getting in the mix and having your voice heard? And how do they engage with NGOs like your own?
Yes. So before I answer your question, I want to just add something that I really wanted to bring up, thinking of our conversation with you. I think it's really, in this debate, it often comes up. NGOs, they want all these things that are not possible and they're delaying things. And on the other hand, we just need these metals. I think I really would like to stress, having been in this space now for a while, that I see that pretty much most of technologies to do things with lower impact, we can't have zero impact mining, but we can improve and reduce the impact, are there. And practices on doing this properly are also there. For example, we know how to engage with local communities and indigenous peoples. We have conventions. We just don't do it all the time. Similarly, on technologies, we have DLE on lithium. We have dry tailings method that if we use this all the time, the impact will be a lot lower. And what for me today is missing in terms of engagement from the mining and commodities community is consistent application of these things that are all available in terms of best available technology, so that some of the criticism that is out there reasonably doesn't have any basis, right? So if you do things to the best standards, there's no critique, and then you can really engage. And I think that's where some of the disagreements today are between NGOs and industry. Now, how do you go about engaging? So actually, the European institutions, so if you really talk about politicians, the European Parliament is the most democratic and open institution in the world. Yes, it's bureaucratic. You need to understand the website and how to contact people, but you can always have an appointment. There is no this horrendous security system like in the UK Parliament, for example. You can go and meet and talk. And there's so many fora today. For example, there's European Raw Materials Alliance, and it's organizing very regular exchanges between everyone from industry to NGOs. And there's many events and fora, especially now that we're discussing the critical raw material sector open. From a perspective NGOs, it's the same. We actually have a lot of already engagement and conversations with the industry. What is really lacking today in Brussels, and it's still there, and it's a bit of a cliche, but this silo approach. NGOs have an event and they talk to other NGOs. Industry has an event on raw materials and they talk to other people in the industry. They all agree among themselves, but between them, there is a bit of a trench war, polarized views. So I would say if you are in this space as a company and you are organizing anything around CRMA Act, don't be scared. Invite NGOs, and similarly to NGOs, invite people from a different perspective so we can all talk it out, because with new technologies and new practices, we're actually a lot closer to each other than we were in the past.
Yeah, and as Jeremy Shapiro said in the episode that went out recently, the European Council on Foreign Relations, just talking about how actually, even if you don't want to be engaging, at some point you're going to have to, if the geopolitical competition carries on the way it is. I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I think an important one as well. And obviously people can find you on LinkedIn and your organization as a starting point for some of this engagement. And I really want to thank you for your time. It's been fascinating.
Paul, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure talking to you, and really great questions back at me as well. Thanks for that.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the show, please give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
To find out more about HC Insider and HC Group, a search and advisory firm dedicated to the commodity markets, visit our website at www.hcgroup.global. There you can find out more about our services, and our offices around the world. There you can also find more content, from interviews to insight pieces to more podcasts focused on the commodity value chains. Thanks again for listening.